issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Get my PowerPoint started. So I should have included the other part of it's the D's of difference and the S's of similarity. But as I said, Jill said she liked the title, but I mentioned that I can't take credit for this title. Actually, let me go to the slide first. I can't take credit for the title. Let me give credit where credit is due. One of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Shelley Harrell at Pepperdine, she's the one who first did a presentation on these D's of difference at the APA convention quite a while ago now, but the first time I heard her present on this concept, it just resonated so much with me. I was like, yes, that makes so much sense. And she's been so kind to, allow me to be able to present this idea and also extend it a little bit. So I'm the one who extended the idea to also include the S's of similarity, because I think the two concepts kind of go together and help us understand each one. So the two references there for myself and my colleagues who extended her idea about the D's of difference. So let me go back and we're going to do a little warm-up activity here. And so I'm going to have the questions up on the screen, but then I'm going to stop sharing for a second so we can all see each other as we do this. So the first thing I want you to do, I should have said think about first. I want you each to think about an experience where you felt different. Meaning you were the only fill in the blank in that situation. So just pause for a second, think back to a time when you felt different. And once you bring up that memory, you're thinking about that time, now reflect on it for a minute and think, what were your thoughts in that situation? What were you thinking about? What were your feelings, your emotions in that situation? And then what did you do? All right, what action did you take in that situation? All right, so an experience where you felt different. What were your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions in that situation? So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so we can all see each other as we do this activity. So first of all, how many of you were able to think of a time when you felt different? Raise your hand. Okay, looks like the majority of us on the call could each think of a time when we felt different. All right, now let me ask this. Who's brave enough to share their story? Okay, go ahead. I see Ruth and then we'll have Tina. So Ruth, go first and then Tina.
Part of my training was to go to an AA meeting. And so I went to I think Richard, you came with me.
I did.
Yeah. And I thought, you asked about feelings, and I thought, are they going to think that I'm an alcoholic too?
They did.
And it just happened that we recognized somebody, but we knew about that you have to stay anonymous, you know. So we just sat down and listened to the testimonies. So that's what happened.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. So you went to an AA meeting and your thought was, oh, I wonder if they're going to think I'm an alcoholic too. Label the emotion that went with that. Can you label the feeling that went with that?
Discomfort. Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so you felt uncomfortable in that situation.
I did. Yeah.
And then what did you do? Like, how did you handle that discomfort?
I just sat there and listened, and we left after that. And I have a number of clients who are recovering alcoholics, so I have more insight about what a meeting is like. So that was a good experience for me. Mhm.
Okay, so you sat there through your discomfort and
Yes,
just
I did.
listened,
Mhm.
and were able to learn something, right? That's helped you work
Exactly.
with your clients.
Right, right.
All right. Thank you, Ruth.
Mhm.
Okay, Tina.
Um, actually, this was kind of, I don't want to say easy for me, but it automatically brought me back to my childhood. I grew up in this small little town in Michigan. It was called Wyandotte. And I can remember in 5th grade, we were offered the ability to take up an instrument, a musical instrument. And I was a big fan of, I grew up in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. I was a big fan of the Carpenters. And so those of you who know the Carpenters, Richard, the brother, played the keyboards, and the sister, Karen, played the drums. Well, they didn't offer keyboards, but they did offer drums. So I thought, okay, I'm going to take up the drums. So I started in 5th grade, and then I went to middle school, junior high. And I distinctly remember I was finishing up in 8th grade, and all along I was the only girl drummer. And I remember in 8th grade, I was going to get ready to go to high school in 9th grade, and my band director came up to me and asked me if I was going to continue to play on in high school. And I said, sure. I didn't even think anything of it. And he totally discouraged me because I was a girl. And I remember feeling really confused because up until that point, all the boys I played with, they didn't make me feel too different, but this band director did. So I remember going home and telling my mom, and my mom immigrated to this country from Japan. So she had this really thick Japanese accent, but she was so angry. And she marched into that school the next day and told the band director, how dare you discourage my daughter from continuing to play the drums in high school just because she's a girl. And I remember then feeling very proud. And I thought, okay, Mom, you're going to stick up for me like this. I'm going to play. And I played in high school. But by the time I was a sophomore, I became first chair. So, yeah, so at that time, he made me feel really different because I was a girl.
Okay.
And so now when I watch marching bands, which I do all the time being part of Tournament of Roses, I look at those drum lines and I look to see if there are any girls. And there's a lot more girls playing drums now than there was when I was growing up.
Okay. So you didn't really notice it because you said the boys didn't really make
No, the
a
boys
big deal
didn't
out of
really,
it,
yeah.
but it was the
that-
teacher who did.
Yeah, that one teacher.
Mhm.
But my mom took care of him.
So and the feeling you mentioned was confused. You said when that teacher said that to you, you were confused,
Yeah.
right?
Because
And so
up until that time, he never, I was just part of the drum ensemble. He didn't make any, reference to the fact that I was a girl until I was getting ready to go to high school. And I don't know if he felt he was protecting me. He was trying to protect me because there aren't any girl drummers in high school. But I wanted to play. And
Yeah.
I did.
So you were confused. So you went home and talked to your mom, shared
Yep.
your confusion with your mom, and then she backed you up.
Yep.
You stood up, and then you had the courage to still go back and keep playing.
Yep. So when I told my mom and her anger, I saw her anger come through and I thought, okay, I'm not confused anymore. I'm as angry as she is.
Okay, so you got angry too,
Mm-hmm.
and you showed that band teacher. Good for you.
Sure did.
All right, thank you both Ruth and Tina for sharing your stories about being different. But as I said, I noticed when the hands went up, almost everybody in the room put their hand up saying they could think of a time when they felt different. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen here. And remember those stories that Tina and Ruth just shared with us, but also your own stories about feeling different, because we're going to go back and reference those as we go through these D's of difference and the S's of similarity. So I already gave you those references. So let's understand what these are. What are the D's of difference? It really stands for the dynamics of difference. And what Shelley Harrell was trying to explain is how we respond in situations or to people that are different or unfamiliar. And what she talks about is how our fight or flight response kicks in, right? So that sort of very basic part of our brain sees something that's different as a potential threat, right? So if our brain interprets it as a potential threat, then it tells the body, hey, prepare. You may have to protect yourself. right? So we know that as the survival instinct or the fight, flight, or freeze response. So if we interpret something as a threat, we may have to protect ourselves. How do we protect ourselves? We might have to fight. We might have to get out of there by fleeing, or sometimes, we're the deer in the headlights, right? And we freeze up and we don't quite know what to do. So notice also when Ruth and Tina were sharing, especially Ruth shared when she went to that AA meeting and she saw that and felt different, and she felt discomfort, right? And that's another thing that happens when we're in a situation. Not only do we sometimes actually feel fear, right? And we feel threatened and we have that fight or flight response, but sometimes it's not that extreme of a response, but it might just be some tension, some discomfort. We're a little uncomfortable, right? When we notice the difference. But these are all natural human responses, right? Notice that it's a natural protective response that our brains have to try to keep us safe. So it's not so much that we have these responses help keep us safe. However, when we're talking about human interactions, when you are encountering people or you're encountering situations like different cultural situations that are different, that are unfamiliar, fighting might not necessarily be the best response. Fleeing or getting out of there might not necessarily be the right response or an effective response, and freezing up and not knowing what to do. So again, it's natural, it's what we do, but as human beings, not always the most effective response in a situation where we encounter something or someone who's different. Okay, so again, these are natural human responses, but not very effective when we're talking about human relations. So let's start with the S's of similarity first, though. And here are a couple questions, right? So the S's of similarity, we're trying to understand, people tend to stick with people who are like them. Have you ever noticed that? We tend to gravitate towards people who are similar to us. And there are reasons for that. And that's what we're getting ready to go to, right? So if you think about the typical high school, Tina just shared with us, she was getting ready to go to high school and you were a band kid, right, Tina? Because you played the drums, you were a band kid. So you probably hung out with the other band kids. And then usually you have the jocks and you have the student government kids and you have the theater kids and you have the stoners who are out by the bleachers, so you have these different groups. And in high school, they tend to hang together, they tend to dress alike, they tend to, use the same slang. Why does that happen? In fact, there's a book. Have any of you ever read this book? Beverly Daniel Tatum, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? She first published it back in 1997. And in 2017, she updated it and published the second edition of the book. Wonderful book if you have not read it. Right. But again, if we think of the typical high school and also college campuses, and you walk into the cafeteria, what do people often notice? People often notice all the Black kids are sitting together and may ask that question, hey, why are all the Black kids sitting together? And when someone asks me a question like that, here's my response. Have you ever noticed that all the white kids sit together too? Right? Like, why do you notice all the Black kids are sitting together? It's because all the white kids are sitting together. Well, again, this is something we sort of naturally do. We naturally gravitate towards people who are similar to us. Think about when you meet somebody for the first time and you're asking questions, you're conversing, what are you really doing? You're actually really searching for where the similarities are when you ask questions. So if you talk to them, you find out, oh, what do you do for work? Oh, you work on a college campus? So do I. Where are you from? Oh, you're from Glendale. I'm from Glendale too, right? So we're looking for those similarities because we're looking for that connection. And we feel like it's easier to connect with somebody who's similar to us, right? So here are the S's of similarity. Why do we do that? Why do we tend, the saying, birds of a feather flock together? Why do we tend to do that? Flock together with people who are similar. One reason is because it's simple. It's easy, right? If it's something that's familiar to us, it doesn't take much effort, right? So if you hang out with people who think like you, who have the same background as you, have the same beliefs as you. That's easy. It doesn't take much effort, right? It's simple. Another S of similarity is because it's safe. It helps us feel comfortable to stick with what's familiar, right? We avoid the threat. Remember, we just talked about if you encounter something or someone that's different, your brain interprets it as a potential threat. You could potentially be in danger. At the very least, you feel uncomfortable, you feel tense. We don't like that. As human beings, we don't like feeling tense and uncomfortable. We will actively do something to get rid of that tension or that discomfort. So if we stick with people who are like us, it's safe. We don't have to worry about feeling threatened. Why? Everybody else thinks the same way that we do. They believe they have the same values, the same experiences or similar experiences. We feel safe. We don't have to worry about that potential threat or feeling uncomfortable. Sticking with what's familiar also helps us feel sane. It's validating, it's reassuring. What? You experienced the same thing? Hey, right? Oh, yeah, you believe that too. You voted for so-and-so, so did I, right? It helps us feel sane, or at least not so crazy, right? If we're around people who do the same things, who believe the same things, it makes us feel normal, right? Or at least not unusual. And again, that's validating. That sort of boosts our self-esteem. Like, oh, there are other people out there who've experienced the same things I have. There are other people out there who like to do the same things that I do. So these are the S's of similarity. Again, a way that I came up with to help describe why we have that tendency as human beings to stick with what's familiar. We seek out people who are similar to us for these reasons, right? Because it's simple, it's safe, and it's sane. So let me pause at this point and just see, does anybody have any questions or any thoughts about these, about the S's of similarity?
Well, I have a thought as you were talking about this, Lori. This seems to be making a lot. I just wrote down, this is fascinating because I have felt this. I have felt the urge to, how do I say this, to stay similar to people with political beliefs lately. I think has just, I've never really felt the urge to stay similar before, but lately I have really felt that. And you really have made that sort of clear for me. I think that's why I feel like I feel safer and sane. When you were talking early on about a situation, I don't want to get too political, but I remember just assuming that I was talking to someone about gun control, and I literally just assumed the person agreed with me. And so I made a comment, and then the person said, oh, well, I don't agree with you. And in fact, they owned a gun, and I was really uncomfortable, and I didn't feel safe or sane, or it wasn't a simple conversation. And I think that's kind of interesting, in that urge to move towards this has actually gotten stronger for me these days.
Yeah.
I don't
So
know if that's,
you're,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you're not the only one. It is safer. I agree with you. This current political climate, yeah, there are just certain, people with certain political views that I just don't want to be around. And, that's okay sometimes. But I also think that that's happening countrywide, right? And that we're becoming so polarized and so siloed, with people who think the same politically, that we're losing our ability to think critically, right? And it's all just this very reactionary, and we become more extreme in our beliefs and not taking the time to see the other side or see the other person's perspective, and at least understand why they think the way that they do, even if we disagree, right? And especially things like social media, where the algorithms are designed that way, that it just keeps feeding you similar stuff, right? So the more I might look at things that are sort of more liberal leaning, the algorithm's going to keep feeding me the same thing. So I'm just getting information that keeps confirming what I already believe. And I'm not seeing stuff for the other side. And the same thing's happening on the other side. You know, we all have our news networks that we watch, and the network probably, again, is similar. It validates, it confirms, it reassures the same beliefs that we already have. So, you know, I think that's something that we're losing, is how to have civil discourse, right? Where we don't believe the same, or being open to ideas that might challenge what we already believe. But yeah, thank you, Jill.
Well, thank you for sharing that too, because I needed that push to more civil discourse. I need to start listening a little bit more. Thank you, Lauren.
Sure, you're welcome. Anybody else have a thought or a question at this point? Okay, now let's get into the D's of difference. The first one is distance. That we tend to avoid situations where we feel different. That's one of the reasons I asked, you know, in our activity, I said, you know, how'd you think? How did you feel? And what did you do? Because what you do is the action, and often what people will do is distance or try to leave. So think about it. I'm sure some of you have been in a situation like this, where you went to a party and you realized you were the only fill in the blank at this party, or maybe it was an event, a work event or something. Or maybe you didn't know anybody there, right? So you felt uncomfortable. And often what do? We leave. We get out of there as soon as it's politely possible, because we feel uncomfortable, because we don't like that, that feeling, that tension, that discomfort. I've heard students on our campus, you know, Cal Poly is a big engineering campus. And, you know, sometimes we get students who come as engineering majors, and then they end up over in psychology because they find out engineering wasn't for them. I've heard so many women tell us stories about in their engineering classes and being one of the only women in their engineering classes and just feeling that pressure. And that was one of the reasons why they left the engineering major, was that pressure of being the only, right? One of the only women in their classes, and feeling that pressure, like, oh, if I don't do well, it's going to be because I'm a woman, right? That people are going to see that. That's an example of distancing, right? Leaving the major because you feel so different, you feel so uncomfortable. So we can distance physically by actually leaving, but we can also distance psychologically. Mentally and emotionally, we can also distance. So physically, our bodies might still be there, but mentally and emotionally, we've checked out. And I'll give you an example of this. Many years ago, this was a long time ago, I had a student who approached me and wanted to do research with me. Now, one of my requirements is, if you do research with me, I do multicultural research. You have to be interested in multicultural psych if you're going to be on my research team. And so, you know, I talked with this student and I said, you know, this was a European American or a white student. And so I said to the student, you know, how much do you know about multicultural psych? And the student was honest. And she said, you know, I really don't know very much. You know, I just want to work with you. So it was more, she was interested in doing research with me, not so much as she was interested in the topic. So I said, okay, if you're going to be on the team, then you need to get up to speed. Like, you need to learn some more stuff about multicultural psych. So on our campus, it's terrible. I'm not even sure if post-pandemic, if they've started doing this again, but every single year there used to be a cross-cultural retreat, which was university-wide. It was sponsored by the university, and students, faculty, and staff would go away for a weekend, and it would be a weekend dedicated to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in my younger professor days, before I had a child, I used to go to the cross-cultural retreat every year. But this particular year, I wasn't going. And so I recommended to the student, I said, well, hey, if you have the opportunity, I think it'd be a good idea for you to go to a cross-cultural retreat. And that's one way to learn more about multicultural stuff. And so she said, okay, you know, I'll do that. And so she signed up and she went. When she came back, I was like, hey, how was the retreat? And she said, well, and she basically started giving me an oral report. You know, it was kind of like, well, on Friday night we did this, and on Saturday morning we did this, and on Saturday afternoon we did this. So she gave me this whole rundown like it was an agenda or, you know, book report about the retreat. And when she was done, I was like, okay. And then I asked her, I said, and where were you during this whole time? And she was like, what? What do you mean? I said, well, you basically reported about what happened, but you didn't tell me anything about your experience at the retreat, because the retreat is very impactful, right? They do a lot of activities and speakers and films and experiential exercise and all that stuff. It's very, if you really commit yourself to it, it's a very soul-searching type of activity. I think I cried every year, I think at some point during the retreat. So it was hard for me to believe, like, how did she go through this whole weekend? And I'm just getting this sort of emotionless, flat report. So I was like, well, what was your experience? And that's when she said, well, she's like, I was pretty uncomfortable. I said, okay, what was it that was making you uncomfortable? She said, well, there were a lot of those people there. I said, those people? I was like, who are you talking about? And she said, the gay people. Oh, okay. She said, they were everywhere. She said, so at different meetings, like they would come and they would sit next to me. And she said, it just made me really uncomfortable. And I thought, we got a lot of work to do. But notice what she did, right? Physically, she went to the cross-cultural retreat, but mentally and emotionally, she checked out because it was making her too uncomfortable. And besides that, besides her discomfort with the LGBTQ plus community, she also had not dealt with her own, race and ethnicity, right? And she admitted that to me. She's like, it's not something I've really thought about, not something I've really dealt with. And that was part of the issue too, right? Is her own discomfort with her own race and ethnicity and not having dealt with that. So I always use that as an example of emotional and mental distancing, right? Yes, physically we can leave a situation because we're uncomfortable, but sometimes we'll stay, but we're checked out. So that's the first thing. Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Tina.
I'm sorry, what year was this was this recently or a long time ago?
This was a while ago. This was probably, let me see. I didn't go to the retreat, so I'm assuming it's after my child was born. So probably early 2000s.
I wonder if she would still feel that uncomfortable. If she,
Yeah,
a lot has changed in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, I don't know, because she graduated and moved on. I saw her a couple times. She came back to visit a couple times after she graduated, but yeah, I don't know. Not sure how much growth there was there after that. All right, second D of difference is deny. Deny, and this is where you pretend that the difference does not exist, or you minimize its importance, or you ignore it altogether, right? So this is where you kind of put the blinders on. In fact, we have a saying, right? Like the colorblind stance or philosophy, where people will say, oh, I don't see color because we're all human beings, right? Aren't we all the same on the inside? Let's not pay too much attention to the differences because they're really not that important anyway. Right? So, oops, sorry, getting ahead of myself. So that's deny. And in fact, the research shows that colorblind philosophy, like a lot of people think, oh, that's progress, right? Like we're moving towards diversity, equity, and inclusion if we're colorblind and we don't see color. Actually, the research shows the opposite. Like people who espouse the colorblind philosophy actually do worse on measures of things like racism, implicit bias, et cetera. And it's actually worse for interpersonal interactions, right? And one of the reasons is, and Shelley Harrell says this, she says, if you don't see my color, then you don't see me, right? Because my color, my race, my ethnicity, my cultural background is a huge part of who I am. And if you try to pretend that you don't see it, well, then you don't want to see me. And why do we pretend it's not there? Because it makes us uncomfortable, right? Remember that dynamic. Human beings, we don't like to feel tense. We don't like to feel uncomfortable. We don't like to feel afraid. We will do almost whatever we can to get rid of that tension and discomfort. So one way to do it is to put the blinders on and pretend it's not there, right? I don't see it. It doesn't matter. It's not that important. When the truth is, it does matter and it is important, right? But we've been socialized to believe that difference is bad, difference is scary, we shouldn't. But and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but you know, it's okay to see it. In fact, we should see it and we should acknowledge it and we should celebrate it and value it. Because think, if we were all the same, life would be pretty boring. What if everybody's favorite color was blue? That'd be pretty boring. What if everybody's favorite sport was basketball? It'd be pretty boring. If everybody's favorite food was Mexican, I mean, we love Mexican food, but that'd be pretty boring if that's all we had access to, right? If we all liked the same kind of music, life would be pretty boring. So the differences are what make us beautiful. So we shouldn't be afraid to see them or acknowledge them. Okay. So denial is another D of difference. Again, it's something we tend to naturally do because we're afraid of the difference. The difference makes us uncomfortable. So we want to pretend it's not there. Okay. Questions about that one, about denying, or comments? Okay, the third one is devalue. And this is seeing what's different as deficient, less valuable, meaningful, or important. When we encounter that thing or that person, that situation that's different or unfamiliar, and our brain interprets it as a threat, the brain also does a threat assessment, right? And the brain says, can I take him, right? Can I do what I need to do to survive in this situation? Or is whatever this is more powerful than me? So in other words, what we do is we form a hierarchy, right? We sort of naturally want to place things in a hierarchy where some things are above and some things are below. And culturally, people from the US actually tend, and I don't have data to back it, well, there probably is some research about it, when we talk about individualism, collectivism. So there's some data to back this up, but Americans tend to have a greater tendency to do this, right? To want to place people in a hierarchy where some people are higher and some people are lower, right? And what we naturally want to do is place people lower in the hierarchy. Why? Because again, that threat assessment, if we place them lower than where we are, we know we can take them right into a literal situation, but it also boosts our self-esteem. It makes us feel better about ourselves, right? When we can place people lower than where we are in the hierarchy. So some examples of this, right? When you see or encounter something from another culture, a lot of times we naturally devalue it and we want to see it as less than. It's not as good as what we have here in the United States, or it's not as good as the way we do things here in the United States, right? Like a very sort of superficial example of this is food, right? What do you do when you see food that's different? Especially if it's from a different culture and it we even look at it and we're like, right? We set up our face and that looks weird, smells weird. Nope, not gonna try it. Right? So we've immediately judged it as not being good. So we're not even gonna try it. Well, in my house, with my daughter growing up, we had a rule. before you said you didn't like something, you had to at least take one bite, chew it up and swallow it. If after you took that one bite, you chewed it up and you swallowed it, you still didn't like it, okay, you at least had to try it. So anyway, food is an example. Did someone have a comment, a question?
Well, I was gonna also say culturally how people dress.
Mhm,
The dress can be very, very different.
exactly.
From what we're used to seeing in the United States.
Mhm. Yes, thank you, Tina. An example of that is the hijab, right? For Muslim women who are covered and wear the hijab. Here in the US, we look at them and we assume they're oppressed, especially if it's 100 and something degrees outside and they're all covered up. We're like, oh, poor woman, why can't she just be free and take it off, right? We assume, and I'm talking about here in the United States, they have a choice, right? There are some countries where they don't have a choice, or else they'll suffer very serious consequences if they go around uncovered. But here in the United States, we think, why do they do that? Why don't they just take it off? That's, so weird, or they're oppressed, those poor women. Have you ever taken the time to speak with a Muslim woman here in the United States who chooses to wear the hijab,
Mhm.
right? And you ask her, why do you wear the hijab? You might be surprised at the answer, right? They don't feel oppressed. They look at Western women and think Western women are oppressed. What? You gotta wear those high heels? You gotta wear those tight clothes in order to feel attractive, right? That's torture, walking around in some high heel. So yeah, thank you for that example, Tina. If we look at dress from other cultures and we devalue it. So those are some examples. Some examples are a little more subtle and not as.
Dr. Barker, I'm sorry,
Yes.
Seth had his hand up. He put it.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Seth. I can't see everybody. So Jill,
Okay,
if you
yeah,
can
so
help
Seth-
me.
Yeah,
I just realized that because I actually had my hand waving around when you asked her questions on denial.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I can't see it. The way I have
I-
my screen set up right now, I can't see everybody.
In looking at it, I saw that we had like 9 people or not 9 windows open with people in them. And I only see 6 on my on the side of my screen. So I'm assuming that I am, off your screen too. But at any rate, I've always been very proud of being colorblind. I happen to actually be red-green colorblind, and when I look at somebody, my first thought isn't they are whatever. My thought is I want to get to know the person. So I don't think that I am, and if I am, please tell me so I can work on it. But I don't think that I am in denial so much. But is there another term I should be using for what I am? Or
How about open?
or do I need to work on my vision a little bit more?
Well, I mean, 2 things. One, if you're literally colorblind, okay, you use that to describe yourself. So there's nothing wrong with saying, I want to get to know this person, right? I just want to get to know who they are. The question would be, are you open to all of that, right? All of what that means to get to know that person. Every part of their experience, even if part of their experience makes you uncomfortable. That would be the question, right? So if you say, there's a term we use now, sort of a more recent term that you all probably have heard, but cultural humility, right? So if you come to the situation from a stance of cultural humility, and part of what cultural humility says is I'm always in the position of the learner, right? I'm always humble. I don't assume that I know everything. So that I always stay open. And yes, part of cultural humility is because I want to make those connections across lines with people from different backgrounds. right? But my way of doing that is to stay in the humble learning position all the time. I don't know. Does that help, Seth?
It gives me something to think about. Thank you.
You're welcome. So sorry, did I miss anybody else's hand?
No, I think.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so I was saying that devalue isn't always so obvious. So for example, if someone sees somebody and they give a compliment and they say, "Oh, you're so beautiful, you look so exotic." And I should have asked, is that a compliment to tell someone they look exotic? You're like, we're afraid to answer. We don't know the answer. Well, it's intended to be a compliment. And it's something we talk about too, the difference between intention and impact. So the intention may have been for it to be a compliment, but what's the impact? The impact is that it's actually insulting, right? To tell someone they look exotic. Why? Because you're othering them, right? You're turning them into more of an object than a person. And it's like an object that's so unfamiliar to you. It's like if you tell a woman, "Oh, you're so beautiful, you look so exotic," she's no longer the girl next door. She's from some, remote island in the South Pacific somewhere that you know nothing about, right? So far removed from you and your experience that you've just placed her that far away from you. So there's a hidden insult in there within the compliment, and that's how the impact, that's how it's received, is as an insult, right? And it's a devaluing of the difference. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Dr.
Yes, go ahead, Jill.
Yeah, sorry.
Now I could see Jill.
Yeah, so-
Go ahead, Jill.
When you said that, I want to ask you if this is an example of that. When the girls were little, and most of my girls are adopted from another country. People would come up to me and, I'm a single parent too. They would come up to me in the grocery store or the park or whatever, and they would say, how wonderful that they would try to give me a compliment and say how wonderful I was that I adopted these girls. And it just really made me mad. I didn't say anything to them, but when you said that just now, I thought it didn't have I know they thought they were giving me a compliment, but it didn't feel like a compliment.
Yeah, great example, because what did you do? You did charity work.
Yeah.
You did missionary work.
Yeah. Then that's not what I did.
Right. Like these kids, yes, they're foreign kids and came from these horrible backgrounds, and oh my goodness, you're a saint for having taken on the
people
burden
told
of
me
this.
that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It didn't
So
feel
yes,
good.
thank you.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. Thank you, Jill. What I thought you were going to say is they called them little China dolls.
Oh, well, I wouldn't put on the recording one comment I had that came from me from a worker at Vaughn's. One of the reasons why I've never gone to a Vaughn's since. So they lost my business.
Yeah, I thought that's what you were going to say at first.
Yeah.
Like they look so cute, like little China dolls. Right. So yeah, also examples. It's like when you say something like, again, the hierarchy, it's putting them down here. Again, they're an object. They're like a little China doll. Why can't they just be a cute kid? Right. Your girls, they're so cute.
I know. On the flip side of that, I will say that in my temple community, when I first decided to adopt, we had a Rabbi Carol Myers who was very supportive, and I've never felt any of that from my temple community. I've never felt anything but them accepting my daughters as my daughters. And in fact, Seth, is kind of like he's just really close to both my daughters and me. And I've never felt, Seth, that, you've ever not felt these were my daughters, so it's nice to feel not have that feeling in my worship place where I worship.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's what I know them as.
Mhm. Exactly. All right, the fourth difference is defensive. And defensive is when we protect ourselves from acknowledging the difference in order to avoid the discomfort. So literally, like, we're defending ourselves from the threat. And, one of the classic defensive statements is, no, I'm not a fill in the blank, because some of my best friends are fill in the blank. I have a story. It's a longer story, but I'll tell the short version. One of my friends, she's actually Haitian, but has lived here in the United States for a long time. She was having a graduation party for her son graduating from high school. So a bunch of, Black teenagers in this neighborhood where they live, which is a predominantly white neighborhood. So some of the boys were outside, and sure enough, the local Karen, sorry to anybody whose name is Karen, but the local Karen was driving by. She didn't like what she saw, so she got out and, was yelling at the boys. And one of the other moms was walking in, and she's, "Are these your kids? Are these your kids?" And my girlfriend, she was like, "Yes, they are my kids." What's the, "Oh, they're, messing up the neighborhood." Right. So my friend comes inside and they're like, "There's this lady outside just going off on the kids." So several of us got up and we went outside. So, you've got these three, well, there were four of us that came out, right? So these three Black moms, two of us are almost 6 feet tall. And you have one of the grandmothers who's out there, and this woman is going up, and the four of us just stood there and looked at her. And at one point, she said it. She goes, "I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. But some of my best friends are Black." And when she said that, I literally laughed out loud. I hadn't said a word before this. I laughed out loud as soon as she said, "Some of my best friends are Black." And then that made her more mad. She goes, "It's not funny. It's not funny." So she actually called the police. So anyway, so like I said, it's a longer story, but when she said she called the police, I told all the boys, I said, "Go inside. Because this woman's trying to get y'all killed." I said, "Go inside." Right. Anyway, she got defensive, even though we weren't saying a word. We were just standing there letting her just run her mouth and sort of dig her deep hole for herself. But she still felt like she had to get defensive, right? That she had to defend herself from these different people who were up in her, this is a good neighborhood, and I know they don't live here. This is a nice neighborhood. I know those boys aren't from here. When one of them, literally, she's standing right in front of their house. So anyway, right? People get defensive when they think you're calling them racist, sexist, homophobic, ableist, ageist, you name it. If people think they're being accused of that, we want to protect ourselves, so we get defensive.
I'm sorry, Dr. Barker, I have to ask, did the police ever show up, or did she just say
Yeah.
she called?
No, they came. And we were ready for them. So, sir, you want to know the rest of the story real quick? So yeah, she finally got tired of her tirade and not getting a reaction out of us, except for my laughter. That was my reaction. So she drove off in her white Suburban, and we made all the kids go inside, and we just told them, "Hey, stay in the house or in the back, don't go outside." Maybe like 30 minutes later or so, there was a knock at the front door, and I was like, "It's the cops." So the same four moms, well, three moms and a grandma, the same four of us went to the door and stepped outside to talk to the police officer. And it was just one white police officer who was there. I didn't look to see if there was another one in the car, but so he said, "Well, we got a call about some teenagers disturbing the peace. Could you have those boys come out here?" And I just looked at him and said, "No." He said, "You're not going to have them come out here?" I said, "No." I was like, "Why are you here?" He said, "Because someone called in a call." the longer story, she accused him of vandalizing a car in the neighborhood. I said, is the owner of the car the person who called you? Well, no, the owner of the car wasn't home. I said, well, when the owner of the car calls you and files a complaint, you come back. And then we'll have something to talk about. It's like, well, can you give me the names of the boys? No. Are you the parents of the boys? No. Can you have the parents come out? No. I said, they're celebrating their son's graduation. I'm not bothering them right now. You can talk to us. And he was so flustered because we weren't intimidated by him and we weren't cooperating. And I just kept saying, when you have a formal complaint from the owners of the car, then you can come back. And so finally he gave up and he left. So that's what happened.
You sound exactly like I have a good friend who's a judge downtown LA. She would have said the same exact stuff. No.
Yeah, it's like you don't have a search warrant. It's not even the person whose car they allegedly vandalized who made the complaint, right? So yeah, no. Anyway, that was my story about the local Karen that day. All right. And people are like, that stuff doesn't really happen. Are you kidding? That's just one story I have. This stuff happens all the time. Actually, okay, back up for a second. So notice all of these D's of difference, they sound pretty negative, right? They do. But one of the things we have to remember again is these are natural human responses. So it's not so much that they happen, it's what we do once they happen, right? So part of my goal this evening is to raise your awareness. So the next time you are in a situation where you feel different, right? That you recognize that fight or flight response when it kicks in, and you recognize if you start doing one of these 4 things, and rather than letting these negatively impact your interactions with people, catch yourself and then choose to do something different, right? So for example, with the distancing, if you're feeling uncomfortable, that urge is going to come. What's the easiest way for me to get out of here? I really just want to get out of here. But rather sit, right? Like, remember, that's what Ruth said. I asked, what'd you do when you felt uncomfortable? She said, well, I sat there and I stayed, right? That's the only way you're going to learn, is to be willing to sit with the discomfort and with the tension, right? Is to sit and stay, as I mentioned, in that place of cultural humility, that open place of learning. That's the only way we're going to effectively deal with each other and these differences. Okay, so I have a story here. It's sort of our pop quiz. Can you spot the D's, right? Can you spot the D's of difference? So here's another one of my stories. I used to do a training workshop for this organization that sent people abroad. They didn't call them missionaries. It was a religious organization. They called them something else because, that term missionaries kind of got a bad connotation. They called them lay mission helpers. So these were people who were preparing to go and live abroad for 2 years. So it was a program similar to Peace Corps, but it was run by a different organization. And so these people who got their assignments, wherever they lived in the United States, they all came to LA for this 6-week program where they were being prepared to go to their countries where they were going to live for 2 years. So I used to come in and do 1 day of their training. And so this was one of the things I would cover during that 1 day. I would teach them about the D's of difference. And so 1 year, and it was usually a pretty small class. I don't think I ever had more than like 7, 8 people in a class. And so this 1 year, I arrived at the house where they all stayed in LA, and it was a bright sunny day outside. And as I got to the door and I rang the bell, as a lot of, the older homes in South LA have, there was like a screen on the door. So when the person opened the inner door, I couldn't really see because it was bright outside. The hallway was dark and the screen was there. But I heard the voice, and it was a woman's voice. And the person said, "Boy, am I glad to see you." okay. So when the woman opened the screen and I came in and my eyes adjusted, I saw it was an African-American woman. And then I thought, okay, I tucked that away, right? Because in my years, I did this probably for about 11, 12 years, this particular training. And in all my years, I think twice I had an African-American person in the class. She was one of them. So when I walked in, that alerted me a little bit, like, okay, something must be going on with the dynamics in the house here. And sure enough, in the class, the small class of people, she was the only African-American person. So again, the day went on, and it was in the afternoon when I covered this. I covered the D's of difference. When I got finished explaining them, she said, that's what's happening to me. And I said, really? Can you elaborate on that? Tell us a little bit about it. And she said, well, yes, here in the house, I feel like the odd person out. She said, you all will go out shopping and you'll invite each other to go out shopping, but nobody will invite me. You all will get up in the morning and you'll ask each other, hey, would you like a cup of coffee? And you'll make coffee for each other, but nobody offers to make coffee for me. You know, you all will sit around and chat with each other and engage each other with conversations. She said, but, you know, rarely does anybody try to engage me in conversation. And so the people around the table, you know, start saying, oh, well, you know, if you ever want to come to the store with us, you can. You're always welcome to come. Or if you want a cup of coffee, why don't you just ask us? Just ask us. We'd be happy to make a cup of coffee for you. And then she told a story about an event that had just happened. One of the benefactors of the program, you know, a wealthy person that lived up in Beverly Hills, threw a party as like a fundraiser for the program. So invited all the people in that current class to come to the party. So they sent a van to pick them up, you know, so they all got dressed up for this fancy party, and the van drove them up to Beverly Hills, and they went to this house, the party. So when the evening was over, this was the woman telling the story. She said, so when the party was over, well, she said, first of all, we got to the party, all of you scattered and went and socialized at the party. She said, most of the party I was by myself and hardly anybody talked to me at all. And at the end of the evening, when we all went back to the front of the house for the valet to bring the van around for us to come back, she said, finally, the host of the party, the woman hosting the party, came up to me. So the host hadn't even spoken to her all evening. And the woman had worn an outfit, like, I don't know what she had on, but I put this picture because she told us she wore like an African outfit to the party. That was her fancy outfit that she dressed up in. So she said the host of the party came up to her as they were standing outside the house ready to leave. And the host said to her, oh, thank you so much for coming. We were so glad to have you. And you look so beautiful. You look just like an African queen. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and pause and ask you, can you spot the D's? So you all tell me, where did you see the various D's of difference?
I'm hearing China doll instead of African queen.
Yeah, so do you remember which D that was, Seth?
It's the third one, but I can't
Yeah.
remember what it was
Right,
called.
right. It was I should put them back up here for you. It was devalue, right? It was devalue. Yeah, so you saw devalue.
And
Anyone's-
she, and the telling someone as they're leaving how glad you were that they came without greeting them, it makes it sound more like how glad I am that you're leaving.
which one?
I think that's distance.
Yes,
I think-
that's distancing. Mhm, yeah. So there was a lot of distancing. Did you hear other examples? So yeah, the host of the party clearly distanced herself from the woman.
It sounds like everyone else did too, if they just ignored her.
Everyone else in the program, right? When they got to the party, they all took off, they distanced. But even in the house where they were all living together, they were distancing themselves. Now, I will also, to be fair, I don't know, I wasn't in the house observing what was going on, but my guess is that the African-American woman may have been doing some distancing herself, right? So there was probably distancing going on both parts. But clearly in the house, it sounded like that's what was happening, is distancing.
Well, she might have been distancing because, also because when you were telling the story, it seemed to me like when she was saying, but you don't invite me to coffee, the other roommates were defensive and said, well, you could
Mhm.
have just
Yeah.
asked us if you wanted to go.
Yeah,
know.
there was the distancing, that
Yeah.
when she brought it up, they
Yeah.
immediately got defensive.
Yeah.
Yes.
I-
Mhm.
Yeah, but
I wonder if they would have gotten the idea if she would have gotten a little bit aggressive and got up in the morning and said, who wants coffee?
Probably not.
I kind of hesitated before saying that because it sounds like I'm blaming the victim, but I don't mean to be doing that anyway. It's
Right,
just a
understood.
thought.
Right, understood, but like, what's a way to bring it to their attention that that's what they're doing, right? Which is what she was doing in the class, is she was calling their attention to what was happening. But, if it was me, one of my I probably just would have said something, but another tactic might have been, if I heard them asking each other if they want coffee, I probably would have just butted in and be like, yeah, I'd like one too, please. Right? Like, yeah, sure, I'd like one too, thank you. Right, that would be sort of my way of calling their attention to it.
But
There-
it is distancing, because if you live in the same house with someone and you're offering a cup of coffee to everybody but this one individual, that's almost more than distancing to me. And to then put the blame on her and say, well,
right.
you could
right.
have asked, I mean,
Right.
you don't feel comfortable because they're not offering. I mean, it's pretty obvious,
Mhm.
I guess is
Mhm.
what I'm saying.
Yeah, I was gonna
Yeah.
say, it's one thing to, it's one thing for all the roommates to say, well, you could have asked, but there's a big difference between that and just being asked, right? It reminds me of like when someone apologizes because they hurt someone's feelings, and instead of just saying, I'm so sorry, they say, I apologize for the way that you feel. To me, that's not an apology.
Right, right.
You
They're
know,
like, oh, I'm
that's-
sorry you feel like that.
Yeah, I'm sorry you feel
Yeah.
like that. That's not an apology. But anyway, so to me, there's a big difference between, well, you could have asked versus just ask her,
Mhm.
even if it's just one person asks her, one person in the it group,
Mhm.
ask
Yeah.
her. So,
So we saw distance, devalue, defensive, and in the defensiveness, there was probably some deny in there as well. So what happened after that in our discussion, as we were sort of tying all this to those D's of difference that we were talking about, there was one woman who got it, like the aha went on. And there were a husband and wife in the class, and she was the wife. And at one point she grabbed her husband's arm and she's like, I get it. She's like, I see it. And he's like, what? She's like, no, I understand what she's saying. And the rest of them were like, oh, we don't get it. So really only one person had the light bulb go on while we were having the conversation. So the end to this story is when the 6 weeks are over and they're all getting ready to graduate from the program, they actually have like a little graduation ceremony, and they would always send me the invitation. And in the invitation, they would list the names of all the graduates, right? And that particular year, when I got the invitation and I looked at the names, the African-American woman's name was not on the list. So what that told me was that she probably ended up leaving the program. I never confirmed that, but just that her name wasn't on the list of graduates, that was my assumption, is that she probably left. So there was the ultimate distancing, right? Her feeling so uncomfortable in that situation that she eventually left. All right, so again, all of these sound kind of negative. Where's the hope? Where's the positive in all of this? Well, the fifth D of difference is the positive one, and it's discovery. And I alluded to this before, right? When I said, we're socialized to be afraid of difference and to be uncomfortable with it. But differences are beautiful. right? So if we can just reframe that for ourselves and not think of the differences as something threatening or something, dangerous or uncomfortable, and instead value those differences, embrace those differences, see them as an opportunity for discovery, right? That we can learn something new. And look at what I've put here. We embrace differences and seek opportunities to gain familiarity. That means seek opportunities where you get outside your comfort zone, right? Where you challenge those S's of similarity and instead of staying where it's comfortable, challenging yourself to get outside and go where you are uncomfortable, right? Because there's growth outside of your comfort zone. That's where the growth takes place. When you get outside your comfort zone, you challenge yourself. Man, I'm forgetting her name. Who wrote White Privilege? Not White Privilege. She wrote White Fragility. Robin DiAngelo. Robin DiAngelo wrote White Fragility, and I know that term is getting a lot of flack right now. There are a lot of people sort of critiquing that term, white fragility, but I actually think it's still useful. Not that, white people are so fragile they're going to break. I like to think of it as a feigned fragility, right? like pretending you're fragile rather than actually being fragile. Any case, in her book, she talks about one of the solutions for the tension we have around difference, whatever those differences are, but she's particularly speaking about racial and ethnic differences, is to make friends with people who are different from you, right? Make friends with people who are different from you. And again, do it from that place of cultural humility, where you're really genuinely doing it because, right, like you said, Seth, earlier, you want to get to know them as a person, but that also means getting to know all of them, not just the parts that are similar that make you comfortable, but also those parts that might be a little difficult and a little uncomfortable. When you're encountering someone who's had a different experience from you, that's discovery, right? Embracing those differences. Like one of my examples of this is travel. I love to travel, partly because I am a multicultural psychologist. I just love going out and experiencing different cultures. What does that mean? That means I get out of my comfort zone. And there are a lot of people that don't travel. Do you know that? There are a lot of people that just don't. And sometimes that blows my mind just because I love it. But there are people who are perfectly comfortable staying in their neighborhood or their area, or at least staying in the United States. You could be in the States and experience different cultures. Like I'm in New York right now. New York is a whole different culture from Southern California. So that is a cultural experience here in the United States. Yes, someone was going to say something. Oh, sorry. I thought I heard someone getting ready to make a comment.
I was laughing. I was in New York a couple of years ago for my daughter's medical school graduation. And there is a shirt that I was wearing, T-shirt, that said Yosemite on it, because it actually spells Yosemite. And the shirts are sold by the, the American National Jewish Museum in Philadelphia, which is where I bought it. And I walked past a construction site, and this guy said, Yosemite, because a certain past president didn't know how to pronounce Yosemite.
So yeah, a cultural experience there in New York. So yeah, so if we take on this attitude of discovery, right? That's how we learn. That's how we grow. That's how we learn to navigate these differences so that rather than keeping us apart, they bring us together. So here's my call to action, right? My question for all of you this evening is, what will you do now that's different, right? Now that hopefully I've raised your awareness, you have some terms, you have some labels for these dynamics, for these things that we experience all the time. And yes, they can sound very negative, but again, it's not the fact that they happen. We all do these things. So it happens, but then how do we respond? Right? If we choose to do something different, that's where we learn, that's where we grow, that's where we connect with each other and build bridges between one another. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we have about 15 minutes for questions.